we consider the spectrum of picky eating, you've got to remember that it's incredibly frustrating and stressful for everyone in the family. At some point, it can shift and become a pediatric feeding disorder. We're also going to discuss several types of anxiety disorders and how those may influence feeding disorders. Anxiety is disordered when the response to the situation is out of proportion to the event. We know that at least 25% of typically developing kids will develop a feeding disorder. Not all kids with feeding disorders have anxiety disorders, but sometimes a child will present with both. Some picky eaters will have anxiety disorders. But I've never met a kid with any sort of feeding challenge, whether it be a picky eater or a feeding disorder, who wasn't anxious around new foods. This course is going to help tease it all out so that you have a better understanding of where your client or your child falls on the spectrum of anxiety and feeding challenges. My goal of sharing this course with you is to provide both professionals and parents an understanding of how anxiety and anxiety disorders may influence a child's feeding challenges and when to seek help from a pediatric feeding specialist or an expert in pediatric anxiety, or both. Remember, it's not really always about the food. We have to consider that these kids may have physiological, sensory, or motor challenges too. But definitely when kids have higher levels of anxiety and it's their norm, it's very easy to assign that feeling to food. And we know that kids who are picky eaters are always going to have a little bit more anxiety, even if they don't have an anxiety disorder. But think of it this way. Think of these children as having an anxiety level higher than, say, the kid next door. On average, depending on the day, all of us have a certain level of anxiety, and certain things can trigger that level to rise. And it's easy, if you're a kid who has more anxiety than usual, to attribute that anxious feeling to something in our environment that shows up a lot, like food. I mean, food shows up breakfast, lunch, and dinner, plus snacks. It's constant across activities and various environments, and kids quickly learn to control it. That's not to say that we might not have these other factors to consider, but the higher levels of anxiety may contribute to our kids' tendency to avoid whatever they think makes them feel the way they do. Anxiety is about thoughts and feelings, but it's not always about reality. When in fact, avoiding these interactions with new foods and new food environments, they're actually feeding the monster and only help anxiety thrive day to day by fueling it with avoidance. As parents, we accidentally reinforce anxiety, especially if we parent compassionately. Our attention is our child's paycheck. We have to be exceptionally careful what we pay them for. And Dr. Dalton goes into a lot of details about this in the 2-hour course. Think about this vicious cycle where a child's relationship with food always influences the family's relationship with food. And that in turn will begin to influence family behavior and parenting style. And that in turn will influence family dynamics. And it will trickle all the way back down to the child's relationship with food. So don't feed the monster. Avoidance is what he loves to eat. Avoidance is fuel and nourishment for anxiety disorders. A child's anxiety disorder cannot thrive without consistent doses of avoidance to help it grow. It's best not to feed the monster. We have to reduce the avoidance behaviors to have the anxiety die a natural death. In this course, we'll not only discuss the relationship between avoidance, anxiety, and pediatric feeding, But we'll also talk about some strategies that parents and therapists can use right away so that we don't feed the monster. Yep, our kids are going to be anxious about this. That's because anxiety is an allergic reaction to uncertainty. When children are uncertain about trying a new food, it's our job to help build familiarity with that food, starting with tolerating the presence of it to eventually eating it, all without feeding the monster his favorite food, avoidance.